I was raised
Hmm.
as a Christian. Um, my you know, cranky old conservative relatives are Christians. You know,
Hmm.
they are not Jews, and they're not Muslims or Maronites or Druze or anything else. They are that's the tradition that I'm born in. And I think one of the important things that I would like to do in my research and writing is that I would like to address these narratives to my tribe
Hmm.
in a
Hmm.
way, if that makes any sense.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, and the reason that I want to do that is that I want to honestly engage with people about the ideas that they have in their head about what's going on in Israel Palestine right now. I It's tempting to argue with them. Now I'm talking personally. You know, I'm not.
Hmm.
This is not like what everybody should be doing. This is what I'm trying to do.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um, I could engage with some of my religious relatives in an aggressive, pugnacious way, but they wouldn't listen to me, right?
Hmm.
We would
Yeah.
just be arguing about it. And what I want to get them to think about is their traditions, their attitudes toward traditions, their attitudes towards what's right and wrong
Hmm.
in Israel, Palestine. And there are certain traditions that Westerners, Western Christians, Western Jews uh, take as historical traditions that are not historical. And it consistently surprises people in the West when they hear this. And so, for example, I was suggesting that we get into specifics. There, if you survey Americans and you try to ferret out what they think about the ancient history of Israel Palestine,
Hmm.
uh, there will be discussion of, you know, the Exodus from Egypt, the Canaanite conquest, etc. And these are ahistorical legends, and
Wow.
we don't we I think we all have a tendency to keep two thoughts in our head.
Hmm.
Hmm.
For example, it's very easy to read an article that is pretty skeptical that there was ever a Canaanite conquest, right? That the proto-Jewish people did not migrate back into the lands of Canaan and
Yeah.
conquer the Canaanites. And you can keep that thought in your head. But when it comes to what a Westerner who's sympathetic to Israel thinks, they can kind of keep that idea aside from the political sense that the Jews conquered the Canaanites. And
Hmm.
the Jewish conquest, the Israelite conquest of the Canaanites is just part of their worldview, especially if you're religious, especially in America's a pretty religious country in the
Hmm.
scheme of things. And those are the kinds of things that I want them to think about. I want to engage with them, and I want to persuade them to think a little bit more subtly
Hmm.
about our traditions, the traditions that we hold. I think I was working around your question without really answering your question, so tell me how I did there.
I think um, so. What I kind of understood is that is there what I'm trying to sorry the thing that I'm trying to understand is what's the correlation between the scriptures from history and this and the Israelite campaign that you were talking about against the Canaanites. How is this related to the like modern history? How are they
Well,
connected?
so if you follow Israeli politics,
Hmm.
which you know is pretty slanted toward the right wing now, I mean certainly there are progressive Israelis active in politics, but you know the tide seems to have turned toward the right wing Israeli politics. If you follow them, there will
Hmm.
be frequent mentions of the Canaanites. You know, even the reference to a Canaanite from an Israeli politician or from an Israeli point of view. I mean, a lot of Americans are very sympathetic to this too.
Yeah.
Even the reference to Canaanites tells you something. It tells you something about their worldview. It's not a morally neutral statement. And when, for example, a right-wing politician is trying to kind of force people out of East Jerusalem, that like East Jerusalem should be Jewish or something like that. A lot of this language starts to seep into there. The lands of Israel, the Canaanites, the people of the land, etc. Um, so that is a political use of what we bucket as a sacred scripture, but the original genesis of the scripture itself was a political statement, right? The people who wrote about the Canaanite conquest were writing a historical background that justified their point of view, that justified an Israelite occupation and presence in Jerusalem. This was thousands of years ago. They didn't know
Wow.
that they didn't know that they were talking to us. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that they were talking about Palestinians or something like that. It was
Hmm.
just a self-interested little narrative about why, my temple, my temple has validity, why my king is the proper king of this little region that I belong with. But it gets recorded as scripture, and then now in the modern day, it becomes a matter of doctrine, a matter of political doctrine.
Could you tell us a bit about the Canaanites and the Canaanite conquest? I'm not too familiar
Oh, sure,
with the
yeah,
history.
I
Mm-hmm.
probably should back up a little bit. So
Mm-hmm.
so Canaan, um, as a historical term, is kind of like the Levant as a
Mm-hmm.
term. It just refers to the region.
Mm-hmm.
So um, the region that we might generally think of as the same boundaries as the Levant or Palestine, Greater Palestine or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the region, occupied roughly by modern Israel and Jordan, and that was Canaan, and it tended to span between the Mesopotamian dynasties and the Egyptian dynasties, and it
Mm-hmm.
was a trade route. It was an interesting trade route. So this is Canaan. It didn't refer to an ethnicity at all. From the Jewish biblical narratives tend to have descriptions of Israelite heroes who occupied or came to reside in the lands of Canaan. The patriarchs, Abraham and his children, excuse me, uh, migrated to Canaan, were friends with the Canaans, got along with the Canaans. Um, what happened during what I was referring to as the Canaanite conquest is that according to the Bible, and this is really very ahistorical,
Mm-hmm.
these descendants of Abraham um, through Israel, through the character Israel, um, fell into slavery in Egypt, and and they were there for like 400 years, and so there was this great nation enslaved in Egypt. Again, this is the way people think about it a lot, and they kind of assume that it's historical or quasi-historical. It's not historical at all. This did not happen. Uh, but the character of Moses, after hundreds of years of slavery in Egypt, brought them brought the Israelite slaves out of Egypt and took them back to the land of Canaan, which was by this time, and the Bible reinforces this, is that was promised to them by Yahweh, by God.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the key thing that I'm getting back around to is that when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, this is the famous Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
He comes back into the promised lands of Canaan. Moses actually dies, but then his general Joshua uh, leads the Israelite armies in conquering the land of Canaan. And the key point about this is that according to biblical scripture, Yahweh is telling them that they must conquer the lands of Canaan. And the reason that they have to conquer it is not because they're justified in taking it, but that the Canaanites are evil and that the Canaanites need to be driven from this land. So they're not doing it by right, according to the
Wow.
Bible. They're
Mm-hmm.
doing it because God's telling them how bad the Canaanites are. So Joshua, according to the Bible, successfully conquers the Canaanites. And so there are all sorts of examples. If you want to hold this up as, well, this is scripture, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, there are all sorts of examples in the Bible that reinforce it. It doesn't take a whole lot of cherry picking to find justification for that in the Bible. But the key, so let's do a little bit of a thought exercise. So let's say that you're that you are a priest at the temple in Jerusalem in 700 BCE. We say BCE right now. And
Yeah.
you're trying to explain to everybody why they should be tithing to the temple, sacrificing to the temple, paying attention to the temple, etc. And also why the king of Judah, of Jerusalem, is the legitimate king. Well, what you do, and what people have done for hundreds and thousands of years, is that you come up with this backstory. And this backstory has to do with the Israelites conquering the Canaanites and King David, being favored by God, et cetera, and establishing his capital in Jerusalem. We do stuff like that all the time today. The same thing goes on today. Let me take a little bit of a leap with you. So if you want a job in the upcoming American administration, you, and this has been reported, you need to tell the interviewer that you believe that the 2000 election was stolen.
Wow.
Right? Okay, so the 2000 election was not stolen, right? But, and 90% of the people who just want a job in the new administration know that. But you have to say that. You have to say that if you want to be part of the power structure. You have to kind of embrace this myth. And whether people were doing it consciously or unconsciously or cynically or as true believers, there are these myths that develop around who is supposed to be in power, who is in legitimate power. And these grew up in Jerusalem, just like in Iron Age Jerusalem, just like they grew up everywhere else. Putting aside the passion and feelings about what's going on there now, and I don't mean to discount them, I mean just don't consider them right now. But putting that aside for a second, people have always done this. You go to any culture anywhere, and you find the king and you find the temple priests from long ago, and they've got a story. They've got a story about how his ancestor talked to God, and how this God visited the temple, and that's why this is legitimate. Those other guys are not legitimate. Blah 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 blah. It happens all the time. What's odd about these stories, the stories that I'm recounting now, and we're focusing on the Israelite Jewish stories right now, but there are Christian stories that run along the same way. There are Muslim, Islamic stories that do exactly the same thing. They create these narratives. The narratives are useful politically because they get people engaged. They resist the other on behalf of the tribe and on behalf of the elites of the tribe. And everybody does this. Everybody thinks in terms of stories, and everybody has these mythic backstories, and it's happening now in the United States.
Wow. So it sounds like it's more than just a normal political war. By political incentives, there's more of a mythology, or like a holy war. Would you describe it as that?
Yeah, yeah. But I've had people comment about they've seen an essay that I've done, or are reading drafts of the book that I'm working on right now, and they'll come back to me with comments about disputes that I had no idea existed. Like there apparently, I don't follow this, but apparently there have been some really ugly disputes about Hindu temples taking over possession over Buddhist temples or other temples in India, and there's a very complex multi-religious society there. It seems to frequently have to do with a sacred spot and who has possession of a sacred spot, which certainly applies in Jerusalem. And it's just it brings people to horrible circumstances, and it encourages people to do horrible things like genocide. But but nobody is immune from this. Nobody is not doing this. And that's why I bring up these kind of secular American examples, because I think that would resonate with people in the United States. And also not to try to say, oh, well, that's religious. That's a religious story. That doesn't properly belong in politics. It all has to do with identity and possession, which is a religious and political issue. It's not these stories. It's just confusing to try to think of these things as religious and not political, or political and not religious in my mind.
Wow. Yeah, they're kind of tied together. So what is the truth behind these myths that we talked about, the Canaanites? So you're saying that it's a myth, it's a story, but it never actually happened historically.
Yeah. And you're not, when you post this, you're not going to get a whole lot of comments to say, oh yeah, that's exactly right. So there's in tracking this, I think the trend is pretty clear, and the struggle over the past 100 years to figure out, over the past 200 years, say, to figure out what's true in the Bible versus what's not true in the Bible is fascinating in and of itself. And what you get is you get people who have lived with these stories all of their lives, and they go to Israel Palestine, and they start digging, and they start finding stuff, and trying to separate out what they're finding from what what they've read in the Bible is just almost inhumanly impossible. It's much harder than you might think. I was interviewing an archaeologist at Tel Aviv University, kind of an emeritus archaeologist there, named Zeb Herzog. Great guy, so helpful, super helpful. And I asked him, I said, so he's been an archaeologist all of his life, and he has been the center of a lot of controversy about just saying in newspaper articles, et cetera, this is not true, and the kind of storm that follows from all that. And I said, so what's the difference between archaeology and other kind of scientific endeavors, especially having to do with the Holy Land? And like physics or math or astronomy or something like that, what's the difference? And he said, all those other disciplines are not cursed with having a Bible. I mean, on the one hand, you have an explanation, in your hand about what all of this stuff is, and then you start digging stuff, and then there's this real struggle about there's just this tendency to say, oh, I bet that's evidence of something in the Bible. But what you were asking about is what's true and what's not true. And I'm going to give a simple opinion that is fairly safe, but people will jump all over it no matter what. And that is this: is that as far as the now we're focusing on the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. Same principles apply to the Christian Gospels. I don't understand Islam as well, but you can certainly see it in Islam as well. And in the Hebrew Bible, there is a at the core of the Hebrew Bible is a history of the Jewish people, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
from creation, God creating the earth and all that kind of stuff, down to like around the third or fourth century BCE. What happens is that much of that was written or was kind of compiled into written form. I'm simplifying here, but much of it was compiled into written form around the seventh or eighth at the earliest century BCE. And then there were more books that were added, as history went along. The interesting thing about it is that all the stories that go back further than the seventh or eighth century BCE, essentially stories that even at the time were ancient stories,
Mm-hmm.
those are all suspicious. And then around the time of the later so-called Davidic kings in Jerusalem, where a lot of these things were being produced, suddenly the stories start taking on a completely different character. There's still a lot of political spin in them. This is the Judahite perspective on it versus the Babylonian perspective on it. But you can find a Babylonian account of the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
which is very different than these old stories
Oh,
that
wow.
you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when the Bible says that the elite of Judah, the kings and the temple priests and all the cognoscenti were taken off to Babylon, that's something that's in the Bible, but you can find Babylonian records of the same kings named and an account of how much oil their household was given, while they were in captivity in Babylon. So that's a completely different character than the stories about Solomon, for example, who would have lived hundreds of years before this, where Solomon did this and that and this and that, and he was here and all that, and it might mention historically accurate names, but nobody else says boo about Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
And for years, I think it's fair to say what many archaeologists did was that they went to the Holy Land, they dug something up, and they said, "Ooh, could this be part of Solomon's, fortress or something like that?" And very slowly over time, the answer is nope, no, it's not. So, I'm sorry, I'm not answering this succinctly, but
That's a difficult one. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
from the Exodus to the Canaanite conquest
Mm-hmm.
to there's a period of the Judges in the Hebrew Bible to the Davidic kings to David and Solomon. That's all very suspicious.
Wow.
David and Solomon are they're intriguing indications, especially with David, that he may have been a historical figure,
Mm-hmm.
but there are also indications that his what he accomplished politically during his life was blown up all out of proportion. So he was kind of turned into a political superhero that where you, you know I personally unknown about whether he actually existed or not, but certainly didn't do everything that he was credited
Mm-hmm.
with doing.
Okay. Wow.
So I wanted to have a question a bit more about Solomon. Why did people maybe not want to talk about his stories a bit more? Was he like a fearful individual?
Yeah, well, he's certainly a pivotal character. David and Solomon both,
Mm-hmm.
and I put the two of them together because
Mm-hmm.
Solomon is David's son according to the Bible, and the they're like each of them had a major accomplishment. Um, and if they did live, they would have lived, and this is kind of easy to remember, they would have lived around 1000 BCE. So the stories that we have in the Bible say are a few hundred years, younger than them. David um, is credited principally with making Jerusalem the capital of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
of Judah, actually. of Judah and Israel, uh, which was very different. Up until that, even in the Bible story, Jerusalem had nothing to do with the history of the Israelites. It was actually a Canaanite city until very late, until kind of suspiciously late. But David made it its capital, and Solomon is credited with his son, um, who was unworldly wealthy and wise and admired the world over, according to the Bible, established the temple, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. According to the Bible, God would not allow David to do that. So Solomon, in Jewish tradition, Solomon or Shlomo in Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
is very much associated with the temple. After Solomon died, Israel rejected the proper way of thinking according to God, and went off and would not respect the temple the way that it should have been templed, etc. And according to the Bible, God allowed the Assyrians to just obliterate them, and so Israel, as opposed to Judah, Jerusalem was the traditional, or was associated with the regional capital of Judah. Israel disappeared. Um, I'm wandering a little bit here, so I'm sorry about that. You ask about Solomon. So Solomon's associated with the temple.
Well, other than the temple and then David changing Jerusalem to being the capital, in current political debates, modern political debates, how do these figures still influence modern politics, or
Yeah,
influence conversations? Because, like, for example, Israel, due to this being also called the holy war at times, does Israel actually have a biblical claim with all of these figures that they have in the region?
Oh, yeah. Because even if you want to be skeptical about the historicity of the figures of David and Solomon, and especially with David, I'm not willing to go that far. But there is certainly a long-standing, Israelite, Jewish, Israelite, proto-Jewish, Hebrew, Jewish association with Jerusalem and Judah. I think it's a stronger and arguably more exclusive relationship with Judah and Jerusalem. Judah being a small southern region of right around Jerusalem and the highlands around Jerusalem, than with what was thought of as Israel, which was a larger northern kingdom extending up toward the Sea of Galilee and the current Lebanon border. But yeah, I think if you want to have if one wants to have a reasonable conversation about this, you have to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is it an exclusive association? Like, is it Jewish and not anybody else? No. I mean, it has had a multi-ethnic makeup all that time, and you see a lot of the sparring about that in the Bible. There's this kind of consistent theme in the Bible about Jews returning to the land, and like during the Canaanite conquest, or even the stories of Abraham, or in later stories about the rebuilding of the temple, about what we think of as Jews returning to the land and trying to do something, establish their ethnicity or something like that, and running into conflicts with the people who are already there. There's this kind of consistent theme about, oh, well, this place already has people living in it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And sometimes this is a little bit mysterious. Like when they try to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, exactly who were these guys who were coming back into the region under the Persian emperor's aegis. And when they argue with the people who are already there about rebuilding the temple, who were those guys? Who exactly were those guys? What we get is that we get the narrative that's passed down from the people who, won, or at least they won out in the narrative. But you see these branches all the time about the different ethnicities and the blend of religious beliefs there. And I think that if there's one thing that's been lost by our exclusive association with the biblical narrative, it's not acknowledging that. Because the biblical narrative is not interested in doing that. The biblical narrative is interested in making a point on behalf of a group of people. And I wish we could broaden our thinking to receive that kind of larger implied message about multi-ethnic participation in this area.
Totally, which is true, and it's historic, and it must be hard for you as a historian to weed out the truths from just the myths that are not founded on anything. And I'm very interested in the actual truths of the situation, of what actually happened back then, because it's important for us to find out, because there's so much propaganda, there's so much just diversions, and people are, like you said, in denial or lying to get somewhere. And I don't know, my understanding of all these religions is that they're supposed to be about telling the truth. Jesus said the truth will set you free. And then in the Jewish tradition, there's a lot of tradition of discourse and debate about truth, and the same thing in Islam as well. So I just find it very difficult to find. I find it ironic that a lot of these people that are espouse truth as the highest virtue to be lying to order to get political benefit.
Yeah,
it's hard to understand. Yeah,
that's well stated. Let me jump back on something you said earlier, Ali,
sure.
about. So I'm not a historian. I've kind of approached this like a journalist.
Okay.
In that, so in the 10 years that I've been researching this, I've read a lot of technical historical works, and I've visited the region over and over again, and I know more about archaeology than technique and history and than a lot of other people. But what I feel like I'm doing is there's something about the Holy Land, and I keep using that term because I don't want to say that it's about Israel, but it's about sacred attitudes toward this region and toward that city. Something about it, there's a lot of passion and love and hatred associated with it, but there's also, it's like nobody's really telling the truth about it either. So it's all garnished with a little bit of bullshit about what happened there. And I feel like what people should do is that they should study and learn. I mean, there are these technical these people who have spent their lives in archaeology and in these arcane historical debates, and I love them for it. I really appreciate them for it. But why are they doing that if people like us aren't going to take the time to read what they're actually saying and think about it and try to apply it to the modern political situation? You can't expect an archaeologist to do that. I mean, if an archaeologist really pounded the table and said, "I don't believe there was a Canaanite conquest," that's asking too much. If you want him or her to be a researcher, you can't ask them to carry, political water for you.
Mm-hmm.
We have to do that ourselves. We have to learn ourselves and question some of our assumptions about the region, if that makes sense.
So do you think maybe that history as a subject is maybe a bit underappreciated to a certain degree? Because
I do. Yeah.
yeah,
Go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
I just wanted to add the point that I think people don't necessarily learn properly from their ancestors' mistakes or from the mistakes of their predecessors, and this leads to just like repeated mistakes throughout
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
And if people were more informed of what you're talking about and like the historical facts, it gives them a different perspective on how to approach certain things, especially when it comes to Israel and Palestine.
I think that's definitely the case. And I also think that it also gives us a little bit of personal experience in how subjective history can be.
Mm-hmm.
I, I think one of the funny things in visiting Israel and my trips, I'm really interested in Jerusalem, and so I tend to I'll visit other places quickly, but I tend to get to Jerusalem every time I go. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting how you get there, and if you're friendly and you act a little bit like a tourist, like I look like an American tourist, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm of an age where if somebody sees me in Jerusalem visiting, they kind of assume that I'm religious and I'm there for
Mm-hmm.
religious reasons. So everybody tries to spin you, right? You get I guess which happens at all kind of tourist locations.
Mm-hmm.
People want
Yes.
to
Yeah.
take you to this or something like that.
Uh-huh.
But the politics is so freighted there that everybody just assumes that you'll believe anything that they tell you. They're trying to get you to do other stuff, which if you are approaching this as a reporter is really interesting. It's like, sure, give me your spiel, tell me more. Oh, that's really fascinating. It's really interesting. But nobody's immune to that.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's doing that.
Yeah, I mean, fair. Yeah, everyone just. Um, Ali, do you have any comments on this?
um, just has anyone ever tried to like? I want to learn more about your journey on this topic. Why are you interested in this topic? You said 10 years ago you started
Mhm.
embarking on learning um, about the history of the Holy Land. Do you want to tell us more about your personal journey? And yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it was something that I didn't used to think about very much until people would ask. They would ask about what why are you writing that book, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And it was useful to me to kind of recall this or think about this. So I was raised in South Texas,
Mm-hmm.
um, in a fairly religious Christian household, and and Texas is a conservative place.
Mm-hmm.
It's everything seems really weirdly partisan now, but it was a little bit more of a friendly conservative place back when I was a kid. And I went to Sunday school, and I was really intrigued by the Bible and the Bible stories. And even as I grew up and I became less and less religious and a little bit more skeptical in my outlook,
Yeah.
and I am kind of skeptical of a lot of things. Um, the the Bible stories still kind of stuck with me, and I had a lot of the questions that I sense in you, Ollie,
Mm-hmm.
also about. I just want to know what's true.
Mm-hmm.
You know, did this really happen, or did it not really happen?
Mm-hmm.
And as things got worse and worse in Israel. And I mean, it's just awful now. And but it's hard to remember that the second Intifada seemed awful.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how could it get any worse than that?
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like child's play compared
Mm-hmm.
to what's going on now. But my experience of this was it's getting worse and worse and worse. Religion seems to be an element of this, and and there's a lot of there's some kind of bullshit in these narratives, and this kind of dual thinking where on the one hand you can say, okay, well, so the evidence is that that did not happen at all, but I'm not going to remove that from my thinking about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are
Mm-hmm.
in Israel, on the other hand, which I think is what a lot of Americans do.
Mm-hmm.
Was scandalous in a way, but then also really just interesting. I mean, I hate to say that it was just interesting, but it is interesting that people think that way, that people can think that way. And I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to understand it a little bit better. And then also, I had never been to Jerusalem until 2014.
Wow.
And I had read about all of these places, the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, the
Mhm.
Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I just wanted to see them. Like how big is it? How tall is it? What do people really do there? And
Yeah.
and I try to bring this out in the book that I'm working on too, so that it can be a little bit of a travelogue for people who just kind of want a description of the Dome of the Rock and the Dome
Mm-hmm.
of the Chain and the Haram. So that's what brought me around to it, I think.
Oh, wow.
Nice. And so from all of the history lessons that you've covered and you've looked at, is there like a particular myth or story that modern political leaders have misused the most? Because we talk about narrative and how it shapes stories even in the modern times from scripture and the past, but has it been like maybe misused to have current political agendas possibly?
Well, I'm struggling with trying to come up with a compact and not meandering answer. uh, there are several. I mean, this whole thing about Israelite exceptionalism in the land of Canaan, which
Yeah.
is the theme of the Hebrew Bible, is a large one, but we've kind of we've kind of explored that a lot. There are so I was raised in Christian culture, and the, out of this came the narrative of the Gospels, and um, the Gospels had several threads to it that were very controversial in the early days of Christianity, and a guy I have to mention who just does amazing work on this is a scholar in North Carolina, I think, Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you're familiar with Bart Ehrman's work, but
Yeah.
in terms of early Christianity and the kind of cultural storms that were going on in the evolution of the Christian faith, he's really the go-to guy. He has a great podcast himself, and his lectures are great. His books are great. So I rely on him a lot for a lot of these descriptions. But it's hard. So this is where I run into some of my personal reservations, because the I filter a lot of my moral sense through, Christian ways of looking at things. When I try to be tolerant toward other people, I tend to rely on, uh, you know, gospel examples
Mm-hmm.
rather than hadith examples or Talmud
Mm-hmm.
examples. That's just kind of where I come from. So it's not, and of course I see, even if I'm not a practicing Christian, I feel the beauty of that approach in the way that I assume other people do in their own religious traditions. But Christianity and the idea that Jesus of Nazareth was the Jewish Messiah, which is a foundational, you know, doctrine of Christianity, in modern times has flipped back in a really unfortunate way for, for example, Muslim Palestinians. Uh, in the narrative is is one of Christian fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, and that's why the Christians call the New Testament in some kind of polemical kind of sleight of hand called the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament. It's kind of there you see the kind of appropriation that tends
Mm-hmm.
to go on there. But in the run up to the creation of Mandate Palestine, which gave rise to the state of Israel in 1948, there was a lot of this kind of Christian magical thinking going on about what kind of apocalyptic work was going on by Christians in the West, creating the land, allowing the Jews to return to Palestine. And there was this specific sense that was very prominent in England that if if England or the English power structure were instrumental in allowing the Jews to go to Palestine, that would trigger the return of Jesus. It was called British restorationism.
And they
So
actually believe this as
a,
something like a fact, or yeah.
a very widespread belief among religious leaders in England and in the United States, and it's kind of a tenet of what's thought of as Christian Zionism.
Mm.
So we think of Zionism and it's a very significant phraseology about um, political Zionism, the idea that the Jews should return and create a homeland in Israel. The 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 motor for that was Christian attitudes that they should do this, and it was not Barbara Tuchman. I don't know if you're familiar with Barbara Tuchman.
No.
She's a historian. She's passed away now. Has written some beautiful popular histories, and one of them is of this story, and it's called Bible and Sword, which is the Christian attitudes that led to the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And one of the interesting things that comes out of this story is that the enthusiasm among the British leaders for doing this was not because they were sympathetic to Jews.
Mm-hmm.
They were arguably anti-Semitic in that they wanted it for Christian reasons, eschatological reasons. And part of this belief is that if the Jews returned to Israel, that they would magically see the need to convert to Jesus, to become Christians. And
Wow.
So yeah, this is unimaginable to us, but this was not this was not 3,000 years ago. This was, we're talking about like 1910,
Mm-hmm.
that this was going on. So I gave another one of my classic long-winded answers to your question, but a narrative like that is convoluted,
Mm-hmm.
but it shows how holding on to these traditions has dark implications down the road.
That answer your question, Said?
Yeah. Um,
Eat the mic.
Don't eat the mic, Said.
Sorry about that.
I'm just making sure that I'm being heard. Sorry.
You're fine. Go for it.
Okay. So going into the final question, what we would like to know is what are some key perspectives that don't get enough attention within this conflict?
I think the key questions are the complex, multi-ethnic, diverse religious perspectives that have always been present in this area,
Mm-hmm.
and an understanding of how sacred traditions, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, work to obscure this. And I'd like to bring that up as a consideration along with the fact that we should, and this is difficult to do, but cut the authors of these traditions a little bit of slack. My view is that they were doing what everybody does, what people are doing today, what they're doing. You can see this in the Bible. You can see this on Instagram. People are doing this on Instagram right now. And try to broaden our thinking a little bit while we address, manifest injustice. You need to speak up to that. But to look at some of the roots of some of these hardened attitudes, try to understand them, and try to speak to your culture, one's culture. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
me speak to my culture, others speak to their cultures,
Mm-hmm.
and try to get them to look at the shortcomings of their own traditions and how they're self-interested. That feels like a feel-good response, that's very unrealistic or whatever, but in terms of getting to where we all want to go, I don't think there's another way to do it. I think it's a slow process and a painful process, but I don't think there's another way to do it. And I would just throw out the, Lebanon as
Mm-hmm.
an example of this, in that, Beirut is, the Paris of the West, and that kind of cultural milieu that was not that long, that was just so beautiful and not that long ago. That's not like a liberal pipe dream, an unachievable goal. That happened, and it happened because there was a certain tolerance and understanding and sympathy for alternative points of view from your other points of view about very basic things. And it's a real tragedy how far away we are from Beirut not that long ago,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I agree.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think we could get back there, but these attitudes are hard ingrained. There's a lot of poisonous, toxic anger about this too. But I don't see any other way to do it in a just way. So that's how I would answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Noah, for your insights. I agree. I think more awareness on the matter it would help both sides by a lot, especially the global awareness that we're getting on this specific topic. So more people are aware of what's happening, and that, you know, when we speak about traditions, like if you really look into like the traditions of all of the people from the Abrahamic religions, they all tend to have like similarities, and I think with those similarities you can kind of relate to them at least, and then maybe that will help spread more education, more awareness about each other's cultures, and can reduce the hostilities within that region.
Mm-hmm.
Ali, any final words or
No,
any final questions?
Yeah, I agree. The more we learn about each other, I think the more we can empathize with each other, and I think that's the future to peace. Is, you know, at least understanding each other. That's the first step. And so, yeah, thank you, Noah. I love your book, The Industrialization of Intelligence. We're moving into technological intelligence era, and I'm sure modern tech has shaped a lot of what's going on also in the Middle East too, but that's and I can't wait for your new book to come out too, and once that comes out, look forward to reading it as well.
Good, thank you, and thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the work that you guys are doing with the podcast too. You're hitting some really interesting testimony to some really vital issues, and I'm pleased to be, a segment of that. So good luck with your future podcasts as well.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you so much, Noah. Guys, thank you so much for watching another episode on A to the Show. This was Noah Kennedy with us on this episode. Please don't forget to check out his book, and we'll have all the links in the video. Guys, we salute to cover the camera. Noah, if you want, you can join us. This is how we end the podcast. And peace.
Peace out.